We want to get started today, of course, by sharing the land acknowledgement statement for the Suquamish tribe, as many of us are gathering on Aboriginal lands of the Suquamish people. Chief Seattle said, "Every part of the soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove has been hallowed by some sad or happy event in days long vanished." So as we gather today, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are here is the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and I want to especially thank our presenter, Brittany Kirk of Brittany Kirk Nonprofit Consulting. So Brittany has years of experience in the fundraising world. We're delighted to have her as a Bainbridge Island resident, and she's been engaged with BCF for the last couple of years. Many of you have participated in her fundraising presentation last fall, which was terrific. She's got experience working with many more than 65 nonprofit organizations, raising well over $35 million. And the focus on Brittany's work is capacity building, which is something that's very dear to our heart at BCF. So whether it is through grant writing, through capital campaign assistance, or just through bolstering fundraising programs, Brittany's experience is phenomenal, and she's really gifted at sharing that with others. So today's presentation will be focusing on fundraising basics. But with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Brittany with our great appreciation. Brittany, welcome.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jim. It's nice to be here and nice to see all of you. I see some familiar faces, which is always nice. So today, our plan is that we're going to spend about 15 minutes going through a presentation, some content. Then we're going to move into a little bit of an independent reflection time. I'll give you more instructions when we get there, but you may have received an email this morning with a document that we'll ask you to pull up during that independent reflection time. Then we'll come back and do a few roundtable discussions, meaning we'll break you up into some smaller groups to specifically talk about some of the content I'm sharing today. And then we'll all come back together as a large group to discuss and share. Thanks for adding your name to the chat and your organization. It's great to see you all that way. And with that, I'm going to move into the presentation. And I think you may have all noticed that this meeting is being recorded. So we'll be able to share these slides and the recording later in case that's helpful. All right. So I would like to start off with getting to know you a little bit more. And I have a few options listed on the screen here. And I'd love for you to add to the chat which one you are. And so option A is we are a 100% volunteer-run organization with no staff or contractors. Option B is our board and volunteers do most of the work, but we have a couple part-time staff or some contractors. C is we have 1 to 2 paid full-time employees. D, we have more than that, and E is other. I'm just going to see what the trends are. I want to get to know who's in the room. I guess we could have done a poll on Zoom, but we'll do the chat. That works just as well. So I see some Ds, a lot of Ds, 1 or 2 Cs. Thank you for sharing. A lot of Ds and Cs, it looks like. Okay. Feel free to continue to add your thoughts, add your letter in there as we go. But that helps me understand where you're coming from. And throughout this conversation, I'm going to be sharing some options for thinking about fundraising from a basic perspective and a more advanced perspective along a couple key aspects of fundraising. So as I go, I'd like you to think about which of those categories your organization falls into. And it may vary depending on the aspect of fundraising that we're talking about. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. So small nonprofits, really nonprofits of any size, face unique challenges. And if you're on the smaller side, your team is often made up of volunteers who have other employment or responsibilities. If you're on the larger side, most of your employees are wearing multiple hats, and fundraising may be only one of them. For all nonprofits, funding is often scarce and unpredictable. And so in spite of all these challenges, though, I'm going to share a few aspects of effective fundraising that are the same regardless of the size of the organization or the unique challenges that you're facing in any given time. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so walking through these four, what I would consider four fundraising essentials for nonprofits of any size. And those are a compelling story, a clear budget, a way to track gifts, and systems and skills to build relationships. And so we'll go through these in a lot more detail. The first one that I want to talk about is a compelling story. So no matter your size, sector, location, or how much money you want to raise, in order to really fundraise well, the first thing you need to have is a concise and compelling story that draws your listener in and helps them understand why they would want to be a part of what you're doing. A compelling story really begins with why. Why are you doing what you're doing? The why is the center or the focal point of any good fundraising story. As nonprofit leaders wearing many hats, we often become deeply entrenched in some of the other aspects of our story, the how and the what, the details about the services we're providing, and we sometimes get trapped in the minutia of the day-to-day. But in fundraising, what really pulls donors and funders in is the why of your work. There's a TED Talk by Simon Sinek that I can link to later, where he explains that truly great leaders in any sector, not just nonprofits, start with why. Why are you doing what you're doing, and what is your motivation? And that why can be a really powerful way of articulating the problem that you're solving. It begins to describe your unique response to the problem. So if you can make the why the center of all your fundraising, people will immediately understand why your work matters and why their support can help move the needle. So the why identifies the problem, meaning that part of the story that you will be telling in a fundraising setting is articulating what is the problem you're trying to solve, how are you trying to make the world better, and what systems, obstacles, or barriers stop your vision from becoming a reality. But the why goes a little bit beyond that, or I should say an effective story goes a little bit beyond that. After you've identified the problem, a good story invites the donor into the solution. It answers the question, how can the donor help? What resources do you need to achieve your goals? Or how is your organization a conduit for change? The second building block that was in those four squares that I shared earlier is a clear budget. And I know that at first glance, that might not be an obvious part of an effective fundraising story, but I want to make the case to you today that a clear budget is really just an extension of your clear story. So when you have a clear understanding of your budget and are able to communicate that with donors, it helps donors understand how much money do you need to achieve your goals? Are you a reliable steward of those funds? Meaning, can you use those funds in a way that the donor feels confident in? And does your project have a chance at success? Defining your budget also helps you understand aspects of your story and be confident in that as you're telling it. It helps you communicate what dollars are you aiming to raise? Where will you spend that money once you raise it? And how are you doing towards your goals? So I'm going to give you an example of how a budget is it points out a couple key aspects of a fundraising story. And I want to clarify here that I'm not suggesting that you share your full budget in every single fundraising setting, but rather that you are able to clearly and concisely articulate key aspects of your budget in the right fundraising settings as part of a larger story about what you're inviting donors into. So here's an example. This is a really simple sample organizational budget where I've listed a couple sources of revenue and a couple different types of expenses that an organization might spend money on. As you can see, this is for a relatively small organization, but the same trends apply if you're larger. So in this case, the understanding this budget will help you articulate to a donor how much you need to raise. For this organization, it's about $115,000. How much your project will cost, who else may be supporting you, and where the money will go. So those are things that you can communicate in words, verbally or in writing, in any fundraising setting without actually showing this budget. But understanding your budget informs your ability to tell that clear story once you've first covered the why of what you're doing. So I'm going to put it all together to show you what I'm talking about, how you might be able to articulate a story that incorporates all of these things in a fundraising setting. So like I said before, the story starts with why, or what is the problem that you're trying to solve. This is I'm going to give you a simple fictional example. So let's say stray cats and dogs in Hello Town need food and shelter. The next you move into the what, or the solution. And remember, this is where you have a chance to begin to invite your donor in by saying something like, with your help this year, we can help make sure that 25 animals are safe, fed, and healthy. Then you can articulate the how, which is where you start to bring in the budget. It will cost us this much money to buy food and staff the shelter so we can achieve this goal. And then you make the clear ask or invitation, or bringing in the who, how donors can be a part of it. Your gift of $1,000 will help us get there. So this kind of compelling story is something that I would encourage organizations of any size to spend time and energy investing in building as an organization. This can be something that you write down as a source document that you refer back to. It can be something that you brainstorm together with staff and board, but coming up with a clear and concise way to articulate an invitation into supporting your organization is an essential building block in any kind of effective fundraising. The third building block that I mentioned at the beginning is a way to track gifts. Now, I know that a way to track gifts is, we could have a whole hour plus or maybe many hours on this particular topic. But what I want to share today is, as you're thinking about your specific organization, where you are in your fundraising capacity, think about what is the best next step for you to move forward on tracking gifts. At the basic level, organizations should be keeping track of doing three things related to tracking gifts. Being able to track each specific gift that comes in, meaning I got this check on this day for this many dollars from this person. Be able to acknowledge each gift and thank donors for that gift, even if it's using a template that you send to each donor. And keeping track of each donor separate from each gift. So making sure you know all of the donors who have given to you in the year, as well as their contact information. This is the ground level, the very basic of what a way to track gifts would entail. And this can be done obviously in a fundraising database, but it can also be done really effectively in something like Excel. I think based on the fact that many of you answered C and D in our initial poll, I think you're probably all ready or many of you are ready for the advanced level. So here's some things to think about if you already have those basics in place. Think about being able to analyze and set targets around more than just dollar amount. Some metrics that you might consider related to money, or the amount of money, revenue that you're raising, is the total amount given across different segments and sectors of your donor base. Each donor's average gift size, the number of upgraded donors, the number of asks you've made. By upgraded donors, I mean donors that gave more this year than last year. But then start to move into engagement metrics, trying to understand some of these things that are not dollars in the door, but are indicators of your success as a fundraising person or team. So things like year-over-year donor retention rate. How many of your donors that gave last year are giving this year? These are things you can begin to set goals around if you feel like you've mastered the basic level. Number of new donors that you've acquired. Number of some metrics around volunteers, newsletter and social media followers, or even things like other indicators of donor retention, such as how many donors have given for 2, 3, 4, or 5 years. The fourth square that we are going to talk about today is systems and skills to build relationships. So again, given that a lot of you in the room mentioned that you had fundraising staff, I'm going to share some of the basics and then challenge you to think about a few advanced ways you can move forward in this particular area. So for all fundraising, we like to think about, or we should be thinking about, a donor cycle that begins with cultivation, meaning the first step in accessing donors is really getting to know them. The second step is making a solicitation or an ask. And the third step in the cycle is stewarding or thanking that donor and sharing the impact. This is probably not new information for you, I'm guessing, but what I want to highlight on this slide is that the biggest piece of this cycle is not the actual ask. In fact, if it's a pie chart, the ask is a small piece of all of the fundraising energy and work that goes into this process. I'd like to challenge you to think about what activities and what capacity and what systems do you have in place to work on the cultivation and stewardship sides of things, because that really is the most important and biggest piece of this whole cycle. So at the basic level, what it would look like to start to have systems and skills in place to build relationships are simply making sure that you have touch points throughout the year for thanking and reporting back to your donors and building relationships with them in some way, shape, or form, making sure that you have something in place to do those things. But at the more advanced level, this becomes segmenting your donors, meaning grouping them into different groups based on certain characteristics of those donors, so that you can use different messages and strategies with different categories of people. The other thing at an advanced level that I'd recommend thinking about is implementing a moves management system. That's really a fancy way of saying a structured system for keeping track of each of those touch points throughout the year. I'm going to share more about that on the next slide. So a moves management system, I'm going to give you a quick primer on this. This is also something we could talk about for a long time. But in the basics of moves management is that you have one person in your organization who is designated as sort of the air traffic controller related to building relationships and all of the tasks involved in building relationships with the donors in your community. Surrounding that air traffic controller would be relationship builders. That can be staff, that can be board members, that can be fundraising committee members, but people who are equipped to take small steps throughout the year to foster and cultivate relationships with existing donors and potential donors. And then that air traffic controller is in the middle, helping to manage it all. So the main steps involved in creating a moves management system are to make a list of potential moves, meaning brainstorming together with the people that I described on the previous slide. What are the ways that we can connect with donors and build relationships that are authentic to our organization? Maybe it's things like inviting them to an event, but maybe that's not really the only option. What else could you do? Could you send them a quick email with a quote that you heard from someone in your community about the services you provided? Can you have coffee with them? Can you give them a call? Can you send them a letter? Can you just simply forward on your annual report or a newsletter? The first step is just making a list of what those moves are, and they don't have to be big or grand, but making a list helps you move in the right direction. The second step is making a list of your largest donors and prospects for large donors. The easiest way to do that is to decide together a cutoff or a threshold for a dollar amount that you consider significant for your organization. For some, it might be $50. For some, it might be $1,000. It is going to depend on who your donors are. But deciding, okay, everyone who has given at this level or who has the potential to give at this level, we're going to put into this more formalized moves management system for our organization. The next step would be designating a task manager and relationship builders, similar to like I shared on the slide a couple slides ago. And then customizing your list of moves for each person. So if you have 10 donors on your list, it would be going through and saying, okay, for this person, here's the 3 things we're going to do this year, and here's the timing of when we're going to do them. Here's an example. This is just some fictional information of how you might map out the donor's name, the relationship builder, a few next steps, and a deadline. And where that task manager comes in is holding each of those relationship builders accountable, probably through a meeting, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, where you literally go through and say, okay, did you do this thing? Let's check it off and make sure you know what the next task is. All of this is really, it's surrounding a pretty intuitive process of building relationships with people, but formalizing it and holding people accountable is what helps you actually achieve this at a grander scale when you have a whole portfolio of donors. And lastly, don't be afraid to actually ask for money. And that's where you go back to your story, that other essential building block for fundraising. I have a couple more slides, and then we're going to wrap up this presentation portion and move into some more discussion about these things. So when you are making the ask to those individual or to those donors after or as part of that moves management process, this is relevant if you're thinking about this from a basic or advanced perspective. There's a ladder of effectiveness for interactions with donors that you can consider, with the most effective being at the top of this list and the least effective being at the bottom. So if you have limited capacity as an organization to engage in something like moves management or engage in relationship building with donors, think about the most effective options here, which are at the top, things like personal visits or a call from somebody who might know that person. This list goes down in effectiveness. So down at the bottom would be things like ads or cold calls. And also I want to point out how low special events are in the list. This is based on some best practices in the industry. I didn't come up with this list. All right, and lastly, I want to share, as you're thinking about which donors are the right fit for you to move into that moves management process, think about a couple things. Linkage, meaning who has a connection to the organization or project. An example might be someone who lives in a neighborhood that's affected by a local service or program. Interest, who would be interested in this work? An example might be like people who volunteer for beach cleanup days have demonstrated interest in environmental causes. Or ability, who has the ability financially to make a gift to the organization or project? So linkage, interest, and ability, or LI and A, are three things to consider as you're examining who has the potential to give to our organization and who should be part of this more systematic effort to reach out and build relationships. So we've talked about 4 different building blocks for fundraising: effective story, a compelling story, a clear budget, a system for tracking gifts, and a system for building relationships. We're going to move into a few minutes of independent reflections. So just to give you a heads up of how the rest of this time is going to go, we're going to spend about 10 minutes doing some independent reflections, and I'll explain more about that in a second. We'll come back for some group conversations, and then we'll all come back together into one large group at the end. This independent reflection time is meant to be a gift of thinking time to you. I know that we all have busy schedules, so I want to encourage you to take full advantage of this time. You can mute and turn off your video if you'd like. And there should be a worksheet in your email inbox that has a big long list of reflection questions. Don't try to get to all of them. The goal is to identify maybe 1 to 2 in each category, or pick a category that stood out to you where you know your organization needs some work, and think about those reflection questions, or jot down your answers if you'd like. And then we will come back together into some group discussion. Any questions about what's going to come next? Okay. So you can go